They tell you that slavery was so complete, so total, that black people had no choice but to wait for white people to free them. That enslaved people were helpless, powerless, just victims waiting for rescue. 4 million people in chains, cotton empires built on their backs, an entire economy designed to crush any hope of resistance. But in May 1862, one man proved that racists make the worst enemies because they can't see what's right in front of them. His name was Robert Smalls, and what he pulled off didn't just embarrass the Confederacy. It exposed the fatal flaw in every racist system. They need black people to make it work, but they're too arrogant to think black people are paying attention. That contradiction would cost them everything. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this man's method terrified every white person in power. This is the story they tried to erase from history. The story of how one enslaved man studied his oppressors, learned their weaknesses, and used their own stupidity to destroy them. Robert Smalls was 23 years old, working as a pilot on the CSS Planter in Charleston Harbor. The Confederates trusted him to steer their military ship because, well, he was just property, right? What could property possibly do? They handed him the keys to a gunboat loaded with cannons and ammunition. They taught him every Confederate signal, every password, every secret code needed to pass their military checkpoints. Because in their racist minds, black people were too simple to understand what any of it meant. What they didn't know was that Smalls had been watching them, studying them, memorizing every detail of how they operated. He knew their schedules, their habits, their blind spots. And on May 13th, 1862, he decided to teach them exactly how expensive their arrogance could be. The white officers went ashore that night, like they always did. They left Smalls and the black crew alone with their military vessel, because who was going to stop them? The harbor was surrounded by Confederate forts. The waters were controlled by Confederate guns. Even if these enslaved people tried something crazy, they'd never make it past the first checkpoint. That's exactly what Smalls was counting on them thinking. Early that morning, Smalls put on the captain's uniform. He pulled the captain's hat down low over his face. He fired up the engines and piloted that Confederate warship right toward the exit of Charleston Harbor. First checkpoint was Fort Johnson. Smalls gave the perfect whistle signal. The guards waved him through. Next was Fort Sumter, the most heavily defended position in the harbor. Smalls knew exactly what signal to give. The Confederate soldiers saw their own ship, heard their own codes, and let him sail right past. But that was just the beginning of how badly he was about to embarrass them. Smalls had loaded that ship with something more valuable than Confederate weapons. He had 16 people on board, including his own wife and children, and other enslaved families ready to risk everything for freedom. He wasn't just stealing a ship, he was liberating people. And when he reached the Union blockade and raised that white flag of surrender, he handed over more than just a Confederate vessel. He gave them detailed intelligence about every Confederate defense in Charleston Harbor, maps, troop positions, military secrets that would help the Union win the war. The value of what Smalls delivered was so enormous that Congress voted to give him prize money, $1,500, which was serious money in 1862. But here's what's really wild. The Confederates had been so confident in their system, so sure that black people couldn't think strategically, that they never even considered changing their codes after Smalls escaped. That's right. They kept using the same passwords and signals that Smalls had memorized, because they couldn't accept that a black man had outsmarted them. And this is exactly how they get away with it. By the way, if you want more hidden stories like this, subscribe to Black Stories Untold. Now, back to what happened next. Robert Smalls wasn't done making white people look foolish. After the war, he used his fame and intelligence to do something that really made their heads explode. He ran for Congress and won 5 times. This man, who had been legal property, was now writing the laws of the United States. But the story gets even better, because Smalls had figured out something that would make him rich and powerful for the rest of his life. He bought the house where he had been enslaved. Let that sink in for a second. The house where white people had owned him as property. Robert Smalls purchased it and moved his family in as the legal owners. Every single day, his former enslavers had to see this black man living free in the house where they used to control his every move. That's not just revenge. That's psychological warfare. But Smalls wasn't the only one who understood how to turn racist stupidity into black wealth. Around the same time, another man was watching white politicians make fools of themselves in Washington, D.C. His name was James Wormley, and he was about to show the most powerful white men in America that they needed him more than he needed them. Wormley owned the Wormley Hotel, the most elegant establishment in the nation's capital. While white society pretended he was inferior, these same white politicians couldn't function without his services. They needed somewhere sophisticated to hold their secret meetings, somewhere discreet, somewhere they could trust the owner to keep his mouth shut about their dirty business. In 1877, the most important political deal in American history was negotiated at James Wormley's hotel. The Compromise of 1877, where Republicans and Democrats secretly agreed to end Reconstruction. They were deciding the future of 4 million formerly enslaved people, and they were doing it in a hotel owned by a black man they wouldn't even acknowledge as their equal. Think about the irony. These white politicians were so racist, they wouldn't let black people vote in most of the South. But they were so dependent on James Wormley that they couldn't make their backroom deals without him. He provided the elegant rooms, the fine dining, the perfect service, and most importantly, the discretion. Because Wormley knew something these politicians didn't fully understand yet. Power isn't just about making the rules. Sometimes it's about controlling the room where the rules get made. While these men thought they were using Wormley's hotel, Wormley was building wealth and influence off their hypocrisy. Every secret they shared in his building gave him more insight into how the system really worked. Every private dinner made him more indispensable to people who publicly treated him as less than human. But what these politicians did to end Reconstruction would create a new opportunity for black entrepreneurs who understood that racist blindness works both ways. If white people wanted to separate themselves from black dollars, then black people would just have to build their own economic empire. That's exactly what O.W. Gurley figured out when he looked at a patch of land in Tulsa, Oklahoma that white people didn't want. This is where everything connects. Gurley understood that segregation wasn't just oppression, it was also a business opportunity disguised as racism. If white businesses didn't want to serve black customers, then black customers would have to shop somewhere else. And if Gurley controlled that somewhere else, then every black dollar in Tulsa would flow through his hands. In 1906, Gurley bought 40 acres of land that white Tulsa considered worthless. Too far from downtown, wrong side of the tracks, not the kind of place where respectable white folks wanted to build. Perfect. Gurley opened a grocery store, then a rooming house, then started selling plots to other black entrepreneurs. Within 15 years, that worthless land had become the Greenwood district, Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest black communities in America. Here's how brilliant Gurley's strategy was. In most American cities, black people spent their money at white-owned businesses, and that money immediately left the black community forever. But in Greenwood, when a black person bought groceries from a black-owned store, that store owner might spend his profit at a black-owned restaurant. The restaurant owner might bank at a black-owned bank. The banker might buy insurance from a black-owned agency. The same dollar would circulate through the community over and over, building wealth for dozens of black families, instead of enriching white businesses that didn't even want black customers in the first place. By 1921, Greenwood had more than 10,000 residents. Banks, newspapers, movie theaters, luxury shops, professional offices, black doctors, lawyers, and business owners living in mansions that would make white folks jealous. The community was so successful that people called it Black Wall Street, and white Tulsa started to realize they had made a serious mistake. They had tried to use segregation to keep black people down, but accidentally created the conditions for black people to build independent wealth and power. That's when they showed their true colors. On May 31st, 1921, white mobs attacked Greenwood and burned it to the ground. Planes dropped incendiary bombs on black homes and businesses. The National Guard arrested black residents for trying to defend their own property. In less than 24 hours, they destroyed what black families had spent decades building. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the knowledge that Gurley's method worked. The proof that racist blind spots could be turned into black wealth and power. And even as they were burning down Black Wall Street, another black entrepreneur was studying a different kind of market that white businesses had completely ignored. Her name was Madam C.J. Walker, and she was about to become the wealthiest self-made woman in America by selling products to customers that white companies pretended didn't exist. Walker looked at the beauty industry and saw exactly what O.W. Gurley had seen in Oklahoma real estate. White cosmetic companies were making fortunes selling products to white women, but they acted like black women didn't have hair, didn't have money, and didn't care about how they looked. That ignorance was about to cost them millions of dollars. Starting around 1905, Walker developed a system of hair care products designed specifically for black women. Not only did she create products that actually worked for black hair, she built a sales network of black women who understood the customers because they were the customers. Door-to-door sales, personal consultations, training programs that taught black women how to build their own businesses as Walker agents. Within 10 years, Walker employed thousands of black women across the country. She built a factory in Indianapolis. She opened training colleges. She purchased a mansion in New York that was more luxurious than the homes of white millionaires who still thought she was inferior. The white beauty industry had left millions of dollars on the table because they were too racist to see black women as profitable customers. Walker didn't just pick up that money. She used it to create economic independence for thousands of black families. Every Walker agent who learned to sell hair care products was learning business skills, building customer relationships, and earning income that didn't depend on white employers. Walker had cracked the code that Robert Smalls discovered on that Confederate gunboat 60 years earlier. Racist assumptions make racists predictable. Predictable enemies make mistakes. And those mistakes can be turned into black wealth and power by people smart enough to see the opportunities that arrogance creates. But the most expensive example of this pattern wouldn't happen until the 1980s, when a Harvard-trained lawyer named Reginald Lewis decided to show Wall Street exactly how much their racial assumptions were costing them. Lewis understood that white corporate America in the 1980s operated on a simple racist belief. Black people might be smart enough to work for big companies, but they could never be smart enough to own big companies. That assumption was about to cost them nearly $1 billion. In 1987, Lewis identified a target that perfectly demonstrated white corporate blindness. Beatrice International Foods, a massive company with operations in 31 countries and over $1 billion in annual revenue. The white executives who controlled Beatrice couldn't imagine that a black man could raise the money, structure the deals, and manage the complexity of a leveraged buyout at that scale. They were wrong. Lewis put together a $985 million deal that made Beatrice the largest black-owned company in American history. He used the same leveraged buyout strategies that white Wall Street firms had been using for years, but he used them better, more efficiently, more profitably. The beautiful part wasn't just that Lewis got rich. The beautiful part was that he made his money by purchasing companies from white executives who never saw him coming. They were so blinded by their assumptions about black capability that they couldn't recognize superior strategic thinking, even when it was buying their own companies. Here's what connects all of these stories, from Robert Smalls in 1862 to Reginald Lewis in 1987. Racism doesn't just oppress black people. It makes racists stupid. It creates blind spots. It generates arrogance. It causes strategic mistakes. And for more than a century, brilliant black entrepreneurs have been turning those mistakes into wealth and power. Every time white supremacists built a system designed to contain black people, they accidentally created new opportunities for black people smart enough to study the system and find its weaknesses. Slavery made Confederates dependent on black labor and knowledge, creating the conditions for Robert Smalls to steal their warship. Segregation forced black consumers into separate markets, creating the conditions for O.W. Gurley and Madam C.J. Walker to build business empires. Corporate racism blinded Wall Street to black strategic capability, creating the conditions for Reginald Lewis to outmaneuver white competitors using their own techniques. The pattern is clear. Racism didn't just fail to stop black excellence. It turned racists into exploitable opponents who consistently underestimated black intelligence, discipline, and strategic thinking. And it cost them ships, cities, markets, and billions of dollars in the process. That's the story they don't want you to understand. Not just that individual black people succeeded despite racism, but that racism itself created the strategic vulnerabilities that black excellence exploited for profit. These weren't stories about begging for inclusion or waiting for white approval. These were stories about studying the enemy, identifying their weaknesses, and using their arrogance against them. And that's exactly why they tried to erase these stories from your history books. Because the last thing any oppressive system wants you to know is that oppression makes oppressors vulnerable, that their hatred makes them predictable, and that their assumptions make them losers. This was Black Stories Untold, and as always, thanks for watching. If you want more stories like this, click the video on your screen now.